everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here with Dr. Bir Singh Khalsa. Dr. Khalsa is the Director of Research for the Kundalini Research Institute, a research associate at the Benson Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine, a research affiliate at the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, and an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's conducted research on yoga and yoga therapy since 2001 and has been a practitioner and instruction in the Kundalini tradition since 1973. Dr. Khalsa has research that has evaluated yoga for insomnia, chronic stress, anxiety-related disorders in both workplace and public school settings. He works for the International Association of Yoga Therapists, promoting yoga research as a scientific director for the annual Symposium on Yoga Research, which I believe is coming up soon, and as editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy. He's the medical editor of the Harvard Medical School report, Introduction to Yoga, and the chief editor of the medical book, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. That's an awful lot. So welcome, Satbir. It is truly an honor to speak with you today. I think that particularly in recent years with the active participation of the International Association of Yoga Therapists, there's a lot more interest in research, which is really important if yoga as a modality, as an alternative integrative modality, is going to be taken seriously. You've been doing this since 2001. Can you just take us to an overview of the process of introducing empirical peer-reviewed data into an Eastern philosophy that has in some ways resisted, quantifying data at points?
So this is the key point behind the whole rationale for why we would be doing research on yoga. And research does quantify how things change. And, there's a lot of so-called basic research in yoga, which is understanding the psychology and the physiology of the changes that take place when people practice yoga. And this has a fairly long and growing history, and we're starting to really understand sort of the psychological and physiological mechanisms of how yoga is working. And then parallel to that has been research looking at the efficacy of yoga as a treatment for a variety of different psychological and medical conditions. And this is so-called, yoga therapy. Now, the importance of conducting this research really is twofold. Number one is, as you've suggested, it lends credibility to these practices. It says that these changes that people experience when they practice yoga are real. They're based upon underlying psychophysiology that we understand, and that there's a real benefit to these changes. In terms of the efficacy of yoga for the medical community, that's essential. So in other words, if we want to bring yoga into modern medicine, if we want doctors to be prescribing yoga to their patients as prevention or as treatment, we need to have the research that's conducted to demonstrate that it's safe and that it's effective. And if we can't demonstrate that, they're not capable of just implementing yoga based upon anecdotes or based upon their own beliefs. And so we really need this evidence base to justify that inclusion into the medical system. Now, on other societal levels, there's other societal institutions that yoga might well be very beneficial for. And one of them is the public schools, and the other one is the workplace. And we are starting to see research that's being conducted that shows the relevance and the efficacy of yoga for school children, for children and adolescents in school settings, as well as for workers in the workplace. And so that research, again, is also really pivotal. If policymakers in those societal institutions, the healthcare system, the schools, and the workplace, if those policymakers want to incorporate yoga into those institutions, they need justification. And that's where the research comes in. That's where the quantification comes in.
I think one thing important about what you're saying also is specificity, because we've all had, those of us who are teachers had people come into our class said, my doctor said I should try yoga. Oh, well, what about yoga did your doctor say you should try? He just said to try yoga. She just said to try yoga. Okay, well, I noticed that your body is pretty broken and you're in a vinyasa class. Did they specify what kind of yoga? And there are so many people who think that yoga is asana and only asana, and I'm not discounting asana as an entryway to the mind-body continuum, but what I think is really germane to what you're doing is the specificity of detailing in what ways, so that doctors might have a language for saying this is why I'm saying yoga to you, versus you should try yoga. You seem stressed out. Go try yoga.
Right, exactly. And that is a challenge that we're facing in the field of research to try and sort of develop that specificity. We're really in infancy in the field of research on yoga. We're really asking the question right now, does yoga do anything at all? Show me some benefit. But the other thing that we're finding, and that's very important, is what we're applying as yoga. Most yoga researchers are really, really quite knowledgeable about yoga. They've practiced themselves. They understand that traditional yoga is not just the asanas. It also incorporates the breathing techniques, the pranayama, the deep relaxation component, and very importantly, the meditative component. And so that's really what's been researched mostly, is that traditional form of yoga that incorporates all of those elements. In addition to studying yoga in its traditional format with all of those elements, we also have bodies of research that are being done by researchers who are looking at those specific practices. There are people that are looking at asanas. There's people that are looking at breathing techniques and the effects and the changes that occur there. Relaxation treatments have a long history, even in Western research. And then, of course, there's a whole parallel field of research on meditation that's been ongoing for many decades. So we have research on all of the elements of those four components of what most people are practicing as traditional yoga in the West. But we also have the research on yoga as a global multi-component practice that yields benefit. So, I mean, if we're talking about a doctor, and bringing this now back to your example of the doctor prescribing yoga, it's a big issue because yoga is very diverse. There are a significant number of teachers out there who are doing nothing but asana teaching. It's all about the asanas. There's no relaxation. There's no meditation. It's just, that's it. You sweat and you leave. That's not to say that the traditional yoga is disappearing. That's never going to disappear. It's there. And people do practice that. And there are many lineages and practices available. What we are starting to see with the research, and it's just starting to show this with the body of research that's growing, is that those practices that incorporate more techniques, not just the asanas, but also include pranayama, also include relaxation, and also include the cognitive components of meditation and mindfulness, tend to have slightly stronger outcomes. Now, that's no surprise, because we know that all four of those practices are having benefits. So if you do all four of them, you're more likely to have positive benefit because you're doing more things that affect the underlying psychophysiology of your situation. So that's really important. The other thing that's important about a multi-component practice of yoga is that it offers individuals a choice. Some people will gravitate more towards the asanas. Some people will gravitate more towards the meditative component. And so you're giving them an opportunity to sort of gravitate to a mind-body practice that they really resonate with. And if someone is really someone who is predisposed to practice meditation and you give them just asana, they might not last with it. But if they have a meditative practice within the yoga, then they can gravitate more towards the meditative practice. And the thing about mind-body practice is the word practice. This is a behavioral technique. It doesn't work if you don't do it. Knowing about it doesn't help. Reading about it doesn't help. You actually have to do the practices, and that's measured in minutes and hours of practice. Mm-hmm. And that is determined upon engagement. The more you engage in the practice, the more you're going to benefit. So if you're not an asana person and you're given asanas and the doctor sends you to an asana class, you probably won't last. But if you get the more traditional kind of practice, then there's an opportunity to invest more and engage more in different elements of the practice. And so we find, for example, that pranayama is a technique that people gravitate to almost immediately. It's something they start practicing the next day after their first yoga class. So that's one that really is very easy to do. It's not limited by physical flexibility or muscle strength. It's something that, slow breathing can be done right away. So that's an example of one area that people can really gravitate to, engage in, and get benefit from.
When you were talking, it occurred to me that two things. One is you speak of psychophysiological changes, which I'd like you to talk a little more about. But someone who comes into an asana class with a skilled teacher who is leading breath-based movement rather than hold here and just hold it. I've been in classes with a teacher who just started a stopwatch and said, you're going to hold warrior 2 for 2 minutes. And I can tell you with great confidence that was early in my training and I did not breathe for 2 minutes. But people who skillfully weave breath into a practice of someone who's going to be resistant to those other moments, like take a moment to notice what you feel in the middle of asana practice, can that really elicit some of those physiological responses where all of a sudden one day you go, wow, my blood pressure is better. I don't know why.
Right. And we can actually start sort of creating a model of how these 4 components contribute to the main outcomes that we see with yoga research. So each one of those 4 components, the postures, the breathing, the relaxation, and the meditation, each one of them by themselves or together in some combination of yoga, improve physical functioning. We have a good body of research showing that. And that appears in outcomes like flexibility, muscle strength, respiratory function. And through the mind-body connection, when you do those kinds of practices, you start to affect psychology as well. Now, all 4 of those practices, again, each one of them is capable of making changes. But together, in some form in yoga, they're all a little bit stronger in improving what we call self-regulation of internal state. This is the ability to make changes in your internal psychological and physical functioning. And the 2 areas of self-regulation that are most important and most immediate are improvements in stress regulation and emotion regulation. And with practice over time, people develop the skills of resilience and tolerance to stress and emotional equanimity. And that leads to an overall psychological self-efficacy. And that's really important. Now, it's largely through the meditative component when you pay attention to what you're doing and you focus your attention in a target, whatever that target is in the type of meditation you're practicing. You're engaging the attention networks of the brain. You're learning to focus your attention. And with practice over time, you become more masterful at regulating your attention and noticing the flow of thought and mind wandering that occurs during meditation practice. And you become more skilled at focusing your attention. And you come to a realization eventually that you have the ability to self-regulate your own thought processes and your reaction to your own thought processes. And so you start to become a master of your own thought processes. You come to the realization that you are not your thought processes because you have the ability to have some control over them. Mm-hmm. And that is called metacognition. And it's a very important realization because the majority of people out there really don't have that belief. They're on automatic behavior. What they think is what they do. Mm-hmm. And in yoga, you end up with this relationship, especially through the meditative component, of that realization that a thought is just a thought. And you now have the choice of what to do with that thought, whether you want to react to it, how you want to react to it, whether you want to do anything at all. And that's really important. And that's really critical, especially with mental health conditions, which are really driven by dysfunctional thought processes. So the ability to self-regulate your thought processes is really highly useful for that. Now, the final component that I think that comes out of these four practices, and probably mostly through the meditative practice again, is that when you are engaging the attention networks, you are starting to regulate your central nervous system. And many people start to report experiences of tranquility, peace, harmony, flow, and that starts to deepen a little bit. And many people, and now we're talking about regular practice, typically over months and years, people start talking about deeper changes. They start saying things like, yoga changed my life. They start talking about different goals in life, typically more non-materialistic goals in life. And they start to experience more of this unitive state of consciousness. And that starts to change their life purpose and meaning and their goals in life. And we can sort of package that under a box that I'm going to call pure spirituality. And of course, that was ultimately the goal of yoga practice historically, was as this transcendental practice of generating these unitive states of consciousness. So when you look at that spectrum of all of those changes that take place from the physical level, from the self-regulation of stress and emotion, to the increase in mind-body awareness and mindfulness through the engagement of the attention networks, to the induction of these sort of deeper spiritual states, we're making changes across a broad spectrum of human functioning, from the level of, muscle and connective tissue to the deepest things that humans can experience. And so that's why yoga has this great effect. And because you're covering everything, you're really making better people. You're making better functionally. You're making better function in both psychological and physical realms. And of course, that has relevance for all kinds of human behavior. It has relevance for performance. It has relevance for happiness. It has relevance for medical conditions, because medical conditions are basically disorders of functioning. So when you become better at functioning, that's the rationale for why yoga is helping with psychological and medical conditions.
What I think is marvelous about what you just said is that all of that can happen with a person coming into a class and being skillfully led through a practice and leaving the room and not have any understanding of any of that terminology or any of that research, just that it's been embodied in their practice, and one day they notice things are better.
That's exactly right. And it's just doing the practices makes those changes happen. And those changes are statistically and clinically significant. They're often as strong as any pharmaceutical or drug that you can take for a condition that you might have. And they come with practice. And I think it's really important that people who are sort of recommended to take a yoga class or have heard about a yoga class adopt the right yoga class. Because there's such a variety of opportunities out there for different styles of yoga, it's very important for people to make an informed selection. What this means is the term that many people are familiar with is you have to shop. If you're going to buy a car, there's a lot of choices out there. You have to shop. Same thing with yoga. You have to shop to find the right style of yoga for you. And if you want only asana, that's important. But if you want something, else, then, that has to be into the equation. Then there's a number of other things in the equation. What is the philosophy of that style of yoga? What's the emphasis? How far away is it? What's the cost? There's a lot of things to consider. And so people that make a more informed choice by doing some shopping are likely to engage in the yoga practice they end up with more likely than not. And as I said, it's all about engagement. I've heard many people say, yeah, I tried yoga once.
Yes.
Well, what did you try? I mean, what style? Who was it? Who was the teacher?
I couldn't do anything. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what did they do in the class? And it's really important what the content of the class is, and also who the teacher is, because this, teachers in the same style of yoga can teach very different types of classes and have very different interaction with their students. So it's not just about the yoga style, it's about the content, it's about the teacher, it's about the location, it's about all things. And those things have to be selected very carefully if you're going to have a successful interaction. And when you have that successful interaction, that's gold. because then the individual is not just saying, oh my God, I got to go to yoga class because I promised my doctor I would. Oh my, I
Exactly.
don't want to go. I mean, is there any excuse I have for not going? Instead of that, it becomes Wednesday night is my yoga night. And I'm not scheduling anything out of that because I live and breathe from that practice. And that's when you know people have found exactly what they need in the style and the teacher that's going to work for them.
I want you to talk about that a little bit more. As a teacher, I've been teaching for like 20 years, and I started out teaching everyone in the room the same class. And as I have educated myself more, I'm a yoga therapist, went through a therapy program, study, watch you, realizing that if I'm leading, let's say, a meditation and someone looks like they're being tortured, that's the wrong practice for them. And that I need to give them something else in that moment that might resonate. How can yoga teachers become more adept at look in the room and teach who's in the room, using some of this information that you are uncovering, because it's kind of gold. I mean, it's like solid gold information to say, to me, what I've come down to is I don't teach everyone in the room. If I have more than one person, I don't necessarily teach them all the same class because some things are just not landing, but I have other practices. I can put someone in a walking meditation and have them walk out in pure nirvana who was sitting there like they were being tortured. Can you just talk about teachers and how teachers can, and this is a nice segue because you're going to be teaching a course for us. So it's kind of a nice segue into how maybe you'll be bringing some of that information about how we can practically apply some of what you're talking about to our teaching and our yoga practice. So there was a lot
the issue of teaching is really critical, and of course teaching is a very common profession, and a lot of the elements of what make a good teacher, whether that's a secondary school or a primary school or a preschool teacher, are fairly common. And, it does take skill to interact with people, to convey information, or to get them to do a practice. And that really is skill. And there are many, many skills involved in teaching. And a skillful teacher will be able to engage the entire audience, will be aware of who's in the audience, what's happening with them, how to adjust on the fly, what to say, what not to say, what to do, what not to do, based upon their interaction with the audience or with their class. And that is really the sign and mark of a good teacher. It's also the sign of a good lecturer in an academic setting. I mean, there's nothing worse than walking into a university course and the teacher stands up there and starts droning on with the chalkboard, just droning on for an hour, putting chalk on the board and not engaging with the students. I mean, that is torture, as you've said. And the teacher that can really engage their students is the teacher that's going to be more successful, and it's going to have students that are learning and experiencing something more. So that's really critical. And hopefully that is taught in yoga teacher training. The better teacher training programs are going to produce better teachers, and better teachers are going to give their students a better experience. And so that's really critical.
So you have a class that's coming up. I'm going to tell you the title of it in case you forgot. Your nervous system on yoga, how yoga helps balance mind and body. So it's going to be all about this. And I assume you're going to be bringing in some of the gems and things that you've been discovering with your years of research. But let's go through. There's going to be 3 sessions. The first one is, I'll just ask you to briefly describe what are we going to be doing, how yoga changes the brain, mind, and body. That is the working title of your first, in case you forgot, of your first session.
So what I do in this first session is really I lay out sort of how yoga works. And, I describe these sort of 4 main practices that make traditional yoga. And then I describe these sort of four main elements that we have research on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build the rationale for that. I'm going to show you some of the research evidence that supports how yoga works on the physical body, how the breathing changes the body, how relaxation works, and then how the meditative component works, and then sort of bring all that together in a model that really summarizes based upon research evidence and using modern scientific language to describe how yoga is working on the mind and on the body. And this is a new way, this is a new language to be able to talk about yoga. And this is very valuable for teachers because now, in addition to talking about yoga language, which is like chakras and prana and nadis and so on, now they can start talking about sort of concrete scientific language, things like attention networks and self-regulation of emotion, self-regulation of stress, improvements in autonomic functioning, and so on. And that is a new language. That's the language of modern society. So yoga teachers that listen to that lecture now have a sort of a new way to talk about yoga, one that's more recognizable to the general population as well as to policymakers in society. And so that's the focus of that first lecture. It really is just to cover that whole basic thing about what is the science and research on how yoga affects the mind and the body, and what do we know, and what do we still need to know about that process, and how does that process, how do all those changes that we know about have relevance for us as yoga teachers, as yoga students, as school children, as workplace employees, and as patients? Well, how does that translate in terms of relevance to all of those circumstances?
I kind of feel a little shout out there to not just yoga teachers, but to teachers and to employers and to colleagues and to citizens, that you're talking about these four elements are universal, they're global, and they transcend a practice of yoga, although that's the entry. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think that this languaging is really critical because it is the language of modern society. The science is the language of modern society. If somebody comes up to you and says, so, somebody told me to practice yoga. I understand you practice yoga. So how does it work? And you start talking about chakra and pranas and nadis and meridians and all that stuff. I mean,
their eyes are rolling back in their head.
Yeah, you might as well be talking Swedish. But if you start talking about, how breathing changes the autonomic nervous system, reduces the stress response, improves emotional reactivity, starts to even change your experience of these deep, peaceful, unitive states, improves your flexibility, that is the language of modern society, and they're going to understand it. And because they understand it, they're engaged in it more. And one thing that surprises me a lot of times is, I mostly lecture to people who are already practicing yoga, either teachers or practitioners. And one thing that surprises me is that there's a lot of responses at the end of my lectures. Geez, I'm going to practice yoga more. And my response is, you've already been practicing. That wasn't enough to convince you. Yeah.
If you're playing rock music and you're just doing vinyasa and seeing how long you can stand in a handstand, you might rethink, what are all the aspects of my practice that I'm missing by focusing on the challenge and the competitiveness of, am I doing it right?
In some ways it makes it more real for them because you're giving them evidence that, hey, that breathing technique that you haven't been really getting into, it's really potentially very powerful. And, the thing about, when the teacher asked you to meditate and you were really trying to figure out what your agenda was for tomorrow, well, if you change that and really do the meditation, it may actually enhance your experience a little bit more. So people sort of reinvigorate their interest and their goals in yoga practice because now they see there's actually science that makes it somehow more real. And that's really important for practitioners. And of course, for teachers, as I say, it really gives them a new way to talk to their students and say, listen, when you're doing slow breathing you're directly affecting your central and autonomic nervous system. And that makes it somehow more important for them to really engage in it.
I feel like that's a great segue into session 2, which is talking about the benefits of yoga for stress, resilience, and burnout, which is what you've kind of been getting at, but you'll be more kind of.
Yeah. So in that lecture, what I do is I really lay out what stress is, the prevalence of stress in modern society, how it impacts us, the huge number of effects it has on virtually every system in the body. So really emphasizing the importance of stress. And then also talking about the underlying psychophysiology of stress, how it affects the body, but also how it can be changed, that we can improve our relationship to our stress. Even while the stress stays at the same level, I mean, the stressors that we're experiencing stay at the same level, we can make ourselves change in such a way that we can tolerate those stresses more effectively and bounce back from those stresses more effectively. And then I present the actual research evidence that shows that when yoga interventions are applied in different circumstances, in stressful circumstances, in regular circumstances, people improve their perceived stress, they improve their resilience. And burnout, which is a major issue in the workplace, especially in healthcare, is something that can be addressed with yoga. So
also education, no?
Sorry?
Also education, no?
Well, education, teachers, teaching is a highly stressful occupation, and a lot of teachers are burned out. In fact, we're seeing a lot of teachers leaving the profession because they simply cannot tolerate the stress of that occupation for a variety of reasons. We have already evidence that teachers who end up doing a yoga practice are able to tolerate the level of stress in their occupation more effectively.
Nice. And then the last lecture that you're doing, and I think it is going to, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it's going to weigh more into the specific research you've been doing. It's about how the effects of yoga affect nervous system functioning, sleep, integrity of mental state. Is that more?
Yeah, the third lecture really focuses on sleep and the importance of sleep. Now, sleep is a very important function in our bodies. It affects virtually every function in the body. I mean, everything is affected by the quality and the quantity of our sleep. So I'm really going to introduce that construct about the importance of sleep, how it pervades everything, how it plays a major role in many different disorders, how it is a very subtle and noticeable phenomenon that changes with any kind of internal state. So many disorders are associated with insomnia. And so the slightest sort of imbalance in the mind and the body is often associated with some kind of sleep disturbance. And so sleep is really a very subtle and fine measure of what's going on in the mind and body. And then we'll talk about how insomnia is developed in people. Why it is so prevalent in the population. About a third of the population experience sleep disturbance to some degree over the course of time. And so it's really highly prevalent. And we'll talk about the underlying basis of that, what really keeps that in place, and how yoga can actually impact that through those elements that we've talked about, particularly the element of the stress and emotion regulation.
And you can, through your practice, through your yoga practice, affect the quality of your sleep? Or is there a specific, do you define a specific set of practices that are just about sleep? In other words, is the global effect of yoga going to also impact that sleep? The CDC, by the way, considers it an epidemic, insomnia.
Yes, it is. It is. It's global. Sleep disturbance is global. It's a major problem. And it's a major contributor to the epidemic of non-communicable diseases. So it has enormous significance in modern healthcare and in modern society. And I think that yoga helps both ways. It helps globally. We have research that shows that long-term yoga practitioners in general have better sleep. That one of the most common findings that people who begin a yoga practice talk about is the improvements in sleep. So on that global level, yes, just in normal individuals, people end up sleeping better. And we also now have growing evidence that yoga interventions, general yoga practice, can improve people who have sort of gone into clinically significant sleep disorder like insomnia. And yes, there is also some evidence that very specific yoga practices may be more effective than some others. So one thing that tends to be very powerful is breathing techniques.
Mhm.
So we're starting to see some of that come out. But again, this is really a growing field. And when we're not there yet, where a doctor can then prescribe a specific asana or a specific breathing practice. But eventually we may be there where we start to see that certain types of yoga practices are going to be more effective for certain types of conditions. But what we do now is that global yoga practice, the traditional, especially the traditional practice that incorporates all the elements, really has demonstrated efficacy for improving sleep in general, but also for treating insomnia.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like a really useful class. This has been, for me, a really informative discussion. So to hear 3 hours of you talking about this is kind of exciting to me. I'm kind of a nerd, so but it sounds like it's going to be really fascinating. Thank you for your time today, and I really want to thank you for your work, because I think what you're doing is really advancing our information specifically about why yoga is so effective. Those of us who feel like it's effective are getting language that is relatable and tangible and empirically driven. So I want to thank you for your work and your time today, and I'm so excited about your class. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye, everybody.